He didn't need a woman. He needed help. She wasn't looking for love, just a horizon without a fence. But the moment he claimed her at that auction, their fates were yoked together, and nothing, absolutely nothing, would ever be the same again. The chain around her ankle rattled when she shifted. It was a heavy, ugly sound. The iron was too tight, biting into skin that had been rubbed raw long ago. She didn't flinch, didn't even blink. She just stood there, barefoot in the packed dirt behind the auction platform, while the afternoon sun bore down on her head like a curse from a forgotten god. She was the last one, the only lot left. Everything else had been sold off: horses, tacks, saddles, rifles, and even the other girls. All of them sold except her. No one wanted the girl they called too wild, too tall, too quiet, too strong. They'd stripped her down to a thin cotton shift that did nothing to hide the lean, hard muscle in her arms and back. They'd yanked her red gold hair into a thick rope down her spine, presenting her like she was some kind of prize mule. But no one came forward, not for a bid, not for a look. The crowd was tired, ready to go home, and this girl was just a problem waiting to happen. Until a man in a dust-covered coat stepped out from the shadows of the livery stable. He wasn't a big man, but he stood like he was rooted to the earth. He didn't speak when he saw her, didn't crane his neck to get a better look at the goods. He just looked at her, and the whole world seemed to go quiet for a second. He raised one calloused hand, just slightly, barely past his belt. It was just enough to catch the auctioneer's eye. 30, the rancher said, his voice flat as a cracked plate. A low ripple of laughter spread through the few men still lingering. $30 for a girl who looked like she could snap a man in two. It was a joke. The auctioneer, a sweaty man with a stained collar, shifted awkwardly on his feet. "She ain't exactly a gal made for pleasant company," he hedged, trying to be fair, or maybe trying to protect the buyer from his own foolishness. "Stood down 2 marshals last week when they tried to move her. Broke a man's arm with a broom handle." The man in the coat didn't blink. 40 then, he said, just as flatly. The auctioneer stared, his mouth hanging open. He looked around, hoping for another bid, any bid, to make this seem less strange. No one else moved. No one else even breathed. And that's when something curious happened. The big girl's eyes, which had never left the dirt at her feet, flickered. Her chin, tucked stubbornly low, lifted just a fraction. And something twitched at the corner of her mouth. It wasn't quite a smile, not yet, but it was something. It was the first sign that she was even alive. "Sold," the auctioneer muttered, wiping his brow with the back of his hand. "To, Cal Rorick of Drybrush." The man, Cal, stepped forward. He handed off the worn bills without another word and stood before her. He was sizing her up, not like a man sizes up a woman, but like a carpenter sizes up a piece of timber. She was tall, easily eye to eye with him, even barefoot. Her skin was tanned raw by the sun, her forearms roped with quiet, powerful muscle. She didn't look away. She didn't curtsy or blush or tremble like the other girls had. She only waited, her posture perfect, her gaze level. "You got a name?" Cal asked. His voice was rough, like gravel scraping over stone. "Rhett," she said, just as simply. "Like a wreck." He didn't answer. He just knelt, unlocked the chain from her ankle himself, and handed her the scuffed boots they'd taken from her. She didn't thank him. She just pulled them on, the leather sighing as it settled over her feet, and followed him down the auction steps into a silence that swallowed them both whole. They rode out of the dusty town of 3 Nails just before dusk, and neither of them spoke a single word. Cal's horse was a thick-bodied, patient beast. Rhett rode behind him, not holding on, her hands resting loosely on the back of the saddle, her eyes turned west toward the setting sun. She hadn't asked where they were going. She didn't seem to care. It was as if whatever lay ahead was already, by default, better than what lay behind. Cal's ranch was 40 miles from the nearest town. It wasn't a ranch so much as a declaration of solitude. No neighbors, no roads, just endless sky and dust and land so dry it cracked underfoot like old bones. A main house, a barn, a bunkhouse, and a whole lot of nothing. He didn't explain much when they arrived. He just pointed to the small, weathered bunkhouse. "You'll be sleeping there," he said. "Not in the main house." Rhett didn't argue. She didn't even nod. She walked to the water pump, stripped off the humiliating cotton shift, and scrubbed herself raw in the cold, clear water. She came out clean and unbothered, her long hair dripping down her back. Cal tossed her a set of men's clothes he'd found, a faded canvas shirt and a pair of trousers that only just fit her long legs. She took them without a word, braided her hair again without needing a mirror, and disappeared into the bunkhouse. By morning, she was already in the corral, checking the fencing before Cal had even managed to light the stove for coffee. She moved with a purpose that was unsettling. She tested each post, her broad, scarred hands running over the weathered timber, her eyes scanning for weaknesses. Cal watched her from the porch, a mug of coffee growing cold in his hand. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Because for the first time since his brother died, the ranch didn't feel silent anymore. It felt watched. That first week passed like a dream made of dust and sweat. Rhett worked like someone born to it, but it was more than that. She never waited for instruction. She anticipated needs. She mucked stalls, repaired tack, and soothed the animals with a low hum that seemed to calm even the most skittish goat. She moved through the days like she belonged there, like the fences had always known her weight and the dust had always known her boots. Cal found himself watching her sometimes when she didn't see. He saw the way she lifted 50-pound bales of hay like they were empty sacks. He saw the way the wild colt in the back pen, a creature of pure panic and fury, didn't shy when she passed its enclosure. Its ears would prick forward, and it would watch her, its wild eyes full of a strange curiosity. She never asked for anything. Not a thank you, not a better meal, not a single kind word. But Cal noticed things. He noticed how she always filled her own plate last, after the animals were fed. He noticed how she never let the chickens go hungry, even when supplies were running low. And he noticed something else, something that made the hairs on his arms stand up. Late one night, unable to sleep, he walked the perimeter of his property. It was a habit from years of being alone, of listening for coyotes or rustlers. As he passed the old, collapsed root cellar near the back of the property, a place his brother had always warned him away from, he saw her. Rhett. She was standing over the sunken wooden doors, just staring down at them. There was no light but the moon, but he could see her face. It wasn't curious, it was familiar, like she was looking at an old grave, like she knew exactly what was buried underneath. Before he could call out, she turned, her head snapping in his direction as if she'd heard his thoughts. She didn't look startled. She looked caught. She held his gaze for a long moment across the dusty yard, and in that look, Cal understood. She hadn't stumbled upon this place. She had been looking for it. The question was, why? What secret did his broken-down ranch hold that this strange, silent woman would know about? The unspoken question hung in the air between them for days. Cal didn't ask. Rhett didn't explain. They just worked, the silence stretched taut as a wire. He'd catch her looking at the cellar. She'd catch him watching her. The ranch, once his sanctuary of grief, now felt like a powder keg, and he had no idea who held the match. He started thinking about his brother Thomas, about how he died. A fall from the South Ridge, they'd said, chasing a steer that broke loose. The ground gave way after a rain, a tragic accident. But Thomas was the surest rider Cal had ever known, and he was the one who built the fence around that old cellar, telling Cal it was unstable, dangerous. Just leave it be, Cal. Some things are better left buried. Now, watching Rhett stare at that same spot, those words echoed in his mind with a new, sinister weight. What had his brother been so afraid of? And then came the fire. It started with lightning, a single dry strike in the parched hills miles away. But the wind was hungry that night. Cal saw the glow of it first while riding fence, a terrifying orange blush on the horizon. He turned his horse so fast it nearly stumbled and galloped back toward the ranch, his throat choking on the taste of ash. When he burst into the clearing, he expected to find Rhett packing, or maybe just gone. What he found instead stopped him cold. She was already there, a general commanding an army of one. She'd drawn lines in the dirt, creating fire breaks. She had buckets filled from the pump. She'd even released the horses from the corral, slapping their rumps and sending them galloping into the open flats, away from the barn. She moved with a cold, terrifying efficiency. Cal didn't ask what she was doing. He just grabbed a shovel and joined her. They worked side by side, their movements synchronized, a desperate, silent dance against the approaching flames. They dug and beat at the embers until night swallowed the world whole, until the smoke and the sweat and the fear became one. Ash clung to them like a soot baptism, and when it was finally done, when the last angry spark hissed into the mud they'd created, they stood chest to chest beneath a sky smeared with smoke. The fire had stopped just feet from the barn. Cal looked at her then, really looked at her, like he hadn't before. Her face was smudged with black, her hair had come loose, and there was a wildness in her eyes that mirrored the fire itself. She wasn't just a worker. She wasn't just a body he'd bought cheap. She was someone who had stayed, someone who had fought for this place. "They'll be back," Rhett said, her voice rough, breaking the quiet. The words hit him like a physical blow. Cal's brow furrowed. "What?" "The men who sold me," she said, but her eyes weren't looking at him. They were scanning the darkness beyond the fire line. "They weren't the first, and they don't like when property goes missing." "You're not property," Cal said, the words feeling hollow even to him. "They think I am." And then she added something that chilled him to the bone. "And they'll think this fire was a signal." Cal didn't have time to ask what she meant. The wind picked up then, carrying the scent of rain that never quite came. He thought of his brother, of the years of silence, of all the things he had tried to bury with hard work and solitude, and he realized with a sickening lurch that he hadn't bought help. He had bought a war, and it had just followed him home. Rhett shifted beside him. She didn't ask for protection. She didn't tremble. But in the dim, flickering light, Cal saw it. On the back of her neck, just below the hairline, was a tattoo. A brand. Not a rancher's brand, but something intricate, geometric. A symbol he'd never seen before. It wasn't a mark of ownership. It looked like a designation. He knew, with a certainty that defied all logic, that this had something to do with the seller, with his brother. The secrets of this ranch weren't just Rhett's. They were his, too. He just hadn't known it until now. They started training the colt the next day. It wasn't because it was time. It was because the silence was too loud, filled with unspoken questions and the phantom smell of smoke. The colt was a fury of hooves and panic, a wild thing that had resisted every attempt Cal had ever made to gentle it. But Rhett didn't flinch. She entered the round pen slow and steady. No rope, no whip, just her presence. And Cal watched, stunned into silence, as the animal, after a few frantic circles, stilled. It lowered its head and let her touch its muzzle. It was like watching a mountain tamed by a whisper. "How did you break him?" he asked, his voice low, full of awe. Rhett ran a hand down the colt's powerful neck. "I don't break things," she answered, her eyes distant. He didn't ask what she meant. He was starting to think she wasn't talking about the horse. That night, a rider came. One man, alone, dressed in a suit so fine, it looked like it had never seen a speck of dust. He rode a magnificent black horse that seemed to glide over the cracked earth. He didn't introduce himself. He just dismounted, strode onto the porch as if he owned it, and said, "I believe you have something of mine." He smiled as he said it, a sharp white smile that belonged on a wolf in Sunday clothes. Rhett stood in the doorway behind Cal. She didn't hide. Her shoulders were squared, her face a mask of calm indifference. but Cal could feel the tension radiating off her, a low hum of energy that made the air crackle. "She's not yours," Cal said, his hand resting on the doorframe, blocking the way. "She was sold to me," the man Nathaniel Greaves replied smoothly. "I have the paper, a legal bill of sale from the previous owner." He paused, his eyes flicking to Rhett. "She has a habit of running, a costly habit, but I always get my property back." "You have a problem then?" Cal said, not moving. "Because she was sold again, to me." Greaves's smile widened. It was a terrible sight. But that's the thing about this particular piece of property. The previous sales weren't valid. You see, she was never theirs to sell in the first place." He tapped a finger against his lips, a gesture of mock contemplation. "She belongs to an associate, a very powerful associate who doesn't like loose ends." His gaze drifted past Cal, past Rhett, and settled for a fraction of a second on the far side of the property, right where the old root cellar was. "I'll be back," Greaves said, his voice dropping to a confidential whisper, "with men who fix problems. And we won't just be taking the girl, we'll be taking what she was sent here to find. Give her up, Rorik. You have no idea what you're protecting." And just like that, he turned, mounted his horse, and rode off into the deepening night, leaving a silence behind him that was heavier than any stone. Cal didn't sleep, neither did Rhett. The colt paced nervously in its pen. The chickens were silent. Even the wind seemed to be holding its breath. They were no longer just a rancher and his hired hand. They were keepers of a secret so dangerous it had brought the devil to their door. The second morning came with a hush so deep it felt staged. Cal stepped outside before dawn, his boots scuffing softly against the frozen ground. He didn't light the lantern, didn't wake the chickens. The world was holding its breath, and he intended to listen. Rhett was already up. She stood at the edge of the paddock, one boot planted on the lowest rail, her hair still damp from where she'd washed it in the cold pump water. She didn't speak when he approached, just nodded, her eyes sweeping the hills. Cal followed her gaze. No dust trail, no riders. Not yet. But they were coming. That much was as certain as the sunrise. A man like Greaves, a man who wore polished boots and spoke of powerful associates, didn't make threats he couldn't back up. Especially not when he hinted at something more valuable than a runaway girl. What she was sent here to find. The words echoed in Cal's mind. Was Rhett a runaway? Or was she an agent? A thief sent to recover something? Something his brother Thomas had hidden? The pieces started to click into place with the sickening certainty of a jailed door locking. Thomas's accident. His warnings about the cellar, the ranch's isolation. It wasn't a retreat from the world, it was a hiding place. And now, the lock had been picked. Cal moved through the morning chores like a man in a trance. But now, every creak of the windmill, every moan of the barn door, sounded like a countdown. Rhett mucked the stalls, milked the goats, and set the eggs aside, her movements efficient and wordless. When they passed each other at the water trough, their hands brushed. A jolt, like static electricity, passed between them. She didn't pull away, neither did he. In that brief touch, an understanding was forged. They were in this together, whether they liked it or not. When the sun hit the western ridge, casting long, skeletal shadows across the yard, Cal finally broke the silence. "If they come," he said, his voice low, "we don't run." Rhett looked up from the saddle she was mending, her needle pausing mid-stitch. A faint, grim smile touched her lips. Didn't plan on it. He nodded. That was all, but the look they shared lingered, a silent pact made in the dying light. That night, Cal sat on the porch cleaning his rifle. It wasn't because he wanted to use it, but because the cold, heavy steel felt like the only solid thing in a world that was rapidly turning to smoke. It hadn't been touched in too long. Everything on the ranch felt sharper now, more dangerous. Rhett came out of the bunkhouse holding a steaming cup of coffee, black and bitter. She handed it to him without a word, then sat beside him on the top step, close enough that he could feel the warmth from her shoulder. The stars blinked overhead, pale and small, like distant, forgotten memories. "Your brother," she said finally, her voice so low it was almost part of the wind. "He died here." It wasn't a question. Cal's fingers paused on the oilcloth. He didn't look at her. "Yeah. How?" "Fell off the south ridge, chasing a steer that broke loose. Rains had just come through. Ground gave way." He recited the story like a prayer he'd said 1,000 times, but for the first time the words tasted like lies. Rhett let the silence stretch for a beat. "You blame yourself." Cal exhaled, a sharp, bitter sound. "I was supposed to be there with him. I stayed behind to fix a fence. A single, stupid fence. A choice that had haunted him for 2 years. The wind rustled the dry grass below. "I don't think that's how blame works," she said softly. "Sometimes the land just takes who it wants." She paused, then added, "And sometimes someone else does the taking." Cal didn't respond, but he looked at her then. Really looked. She was watching the horizon, her jaw set, her arms resting on her knees like a soldier waiting for a war. And it struck him then. She wasn't just talking about his brother. She was talking about herself. The next day brought no visitors, but the sense of being watched intensified. Rhett worked harder, faster, as if trying to outrun the coming storm. She cleared the upper field of rocks, her muscles straining against the earth. She helped Cal repair the barn roof after a sudden windstorm peeled half of it back like a tin can lid. She didn't complain, but Cal saw the way she checked over her shoulder constantly, how her eyes flicked to the ridgeline every few minutes. By sunset, a rider came. Not Greaves, not his men, just a boy, maybe 15, on a winded pony. He carried a folded note and refused to dismount, his eyes wide with fear, as if the note itself might bite him. "They told me to give this to the man with the red barn," he stammered. Cal took the note. He unfolded it. 5 words were scrawled in an elegant, mocking hand. "You have until tomorrow noon." The boy didn't wait for a reply. He kicked his pony hard, turning it and disappearing in a cloud of panicked dust. Rhett stepped out of the barn then, a coil of rope in one hand. She saw Cal's face, the stark white letter in his hand, and she knew. "When?" she asked. "Noon," Cal replied, his voice grim. She didn't blink. Her eyes found his, and they were as hard and clear as ice. "Then we don't sleep tonight." They didn't. That night became a quiet, focused orchestration of defiance. Rhett, moving with a predator's grace, oiled the hinges on the back gate of the corral, ensuring it would swing open silently. Cal set lanterns around the property, but far from the house, false signals meant to confuse anyone approaching in the dark, to draw their fire. They moved like a team that had done this 100 times before. Maybe not together, but long enough apart in their own harsh worlds to know what mattered and what didn't. Inside the main house, Cal pried up a loose floorboard beneath his brother's old bed. A place he hadn't looked in 2 years. Inside was a long-forgotten chest. He lifted the lid. 2 pistols, polished and ready, a shotgun, and a small leather-bound pouch. He stared at the pouch for a moment too long, his throat tight, before closing it and tucking it into his belt. Rhett, standing in the doorway, didn't ask what was in it. But later that night, as they stood beside the dying coals of a small, smokeless fire, she looked at him and said, "I won't let them take me." It wasn't a plea. It was a statement of fact. He didn't make a false promise that they wouldn't. He just looked at the dark hills and said, "They'll have to go through me first." The next day rose heavy and slow. Noon approached like a drawn-out, agonizing heartbeat. Every gust of wind sounded like hoofbeats. Every crow calling in the sky felt like a dire warning. Cal stood with his rifle by the barn, the stock cool against his cheek. Rhett stood in the corral with the newly gentled colt. The animal paced nervously, a mirror of the tension that crackled in the air. At exactly 11:53 a.m. they arrived. 6 riders. Not from the main road, but fanning out from the hills, a coordinated attack. 2 wagons followed, kicking up a plume of dust. And at their head, the man in the black coat, Nathaniel Greaves. He dismounted without ceremony, his boots landing softly in the dirt. His men spread out, a semicircle of death, their hands resting casually close to their hips. "I gave you time, Rorik," Greaves said, his voice calm, almost bored. "More than you deserved." Rhett stepped forward from the corral, placing herself between Cal and the riders. The colt stood behind her, a shadow of wildness at her back. "You're not taking me," she said, her voice ringing clear across the yard. "Oh, I'm not here for just you, my dear," Greaves replied with that chilling smile. "You belong to me, of course, bought and paid for, and your new friend here, he's harboring stolen property. That's a serious crime in this territory." He paused, letting the threat hang in the air. "But we both know that's not what this is about, don't we? This is about what my associate wants. What's in that cellar?" "Then you'll need a badge," Cal said, his voice dangerously level. Greaves laughed, a short, ugly sound. "I brought one." One of the riders, an older, grizzled man with a crooked nose, stepped forward and flipped back his duster, revealing a tarnished badge pinned crookedly to his vest. A hired lawman, a gun for rent. "I don't recognize your authority," Cal said plainly. "Then maybe you'll recognize my bullet," Greaves replied, and his hand dropped to his pistol. But the first shot didn't come from Greaves. It didn't come from Cal. It came from the hayloft of the barn. Smoke flared from the dark opening. One of Greaves's riders crumpled backwards off his horse, screaming, his shoulder torn open by the blast. Rhett had hidden a second rifle in the rafters the night before. Chaos erupted. Horses reared, men scattered for cover, shouting curses. Greaves dove behind one of the wagons. In the swirling dust, Cal didn't fire wildly. Not yet. He watched, waited, and then with calm, deadly precision, he aimed once, twice, and shot the rifles clean out of 2 of the enemy's hands. He wasn't aiming to kill. Not yet. He was aiming to disarm, to unmake them. Rhett moved through the yard like a ghost with teeth. The colt, instead of panicking, reared beside her, a furious extension of her will, its hooves lashing out. She darted low, grabbing a dropped rifle from a downed man and dragging it toward Cal, her movements fluid and impossibly fast. They didn't win the fight in that moment, but they didn't lose it either. Because when the dust began to settle, Greaves was gone. He and his crooked-badged lackey had fled, leaving their men and their wagons behind. But the real damage was just beginning. In the scuffle, a lantern had shattered against the side of the bunkhouse. A tiny lick of flame tasted the dry wood, and then greedily devoured it. The wall went up in a sheet of fire. Rhett ran for it, barefoot across the sharp gravel, not even hesitating. Cal shouted her name, but she didn't slow. She burst through the door of the burning building, grabbed a heavy, smoldering blanket off the cot, and threw it out into the water trough. By the time Cal reached her, her hands were black with soot, her shirt scorched through. He grabbed her shoulders, his voice rough with fear and something else. "You could have—" "I didn't," she said simply, cutting him off. Her eyes, red from the smoke, locked onto his. And in that moment, something new and profound passed between them. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about recognition. He saw her, and she saw him. That night was quiet again. No stars could pierce the blanket of smoke that hung low over the valley. Rhett sat beside Cal on the porch steps, her hands clumsily bandaged with strips of his own shirt, her eyes staring into the darkness. He looked at her, at the raw strength in her profile, and his voice was rough when he finally spoke. "You're not what I expected." She didn't smile, but her voice held a note of something warmer than he'd ever heard from her before. "Neither are you." And in the quiet that followed, Cal realized the land hadn't felt this alive, this vital, in years. The silence of his grief had been broken, replaced by the roar of fire and the promise of a war he now knew he had to fight. He reached into his belt and pulled out the small leather pouch he'd taken from his brother's hidden chest. He opened it. Inside wasn't gold or money. It was a single, strange object. A small, intricately carved key made of a dark, unfamiliar wood and a folded, yellowed piece of paper. He unfolded it. It was a letter in his brother's hand. "Cal, if you're reading this, I'm gone. And they've come back for it. Don't trust anyone. The key isn't for the cellar. It's for what's inside. The girl is the only one who can show you. Her name isn't Rhett. Protect her. Thomas." Cal stared at the note, his blood running cold. Greaves wasn't after what was in the cellar. He was after the key. And Rhett wasn't just a runaway. She was the map. For 2 full weeks, the land held its breath. The sky refused to break open with rain. The winds didn't rise, and not a single unfamiliar hoofprint marred the dusty track that served as a road to Cal's ranch. Yet Cal knew better than to trust the calm. Men like Greaves, the kind who rode with forged papers in one hand and fire in the other, never truly left empty-handed. They didn't come for revenge right away, which meant they were waiting, regrouping, or building something far worse. This quiet was just the deep breath before the scream. Rhett healed fast. Almost too fast, Cal thought. The burns on her hands scabbed over in a matter of days, turning from angry red to pale new skin. She never winced when wrapping her palms with the old linen strips he kept in the cupboard. She was back to splitting fence posts without gloves, her bare fingers seemingly impervious to splinters. She worked the colt harder, coaxing it into a saddle by the end of the week, whispering to it in a language that seemed to bypass sound and go straight to instinct. Her silence, which had once been like stone, had changed. It had become something more fluid, a watchful quiet. She still didn't waste breath on small talk, but now, sometimes at night, Cal would hear her humming from the bunkhouse. It wasn't a tune he knew, something low and haunting, like the memory of a lullaby no one had ever actually sung to her. He didn't press her about the note from his brother. He didn't ask her real name. The paper sat in his pocket, a constant weight, a promise and a warning. The girl is the only one who can show you. Show him what? He spent his nights staring at the old root cellar, the key feeling alternately hot and cold in his hand. He tried it on the old iron padlock Thomas had put there, but it didn't fit. Of course it didn't. The key isn't for the cellar. It's for what's inside. It was Nathaniel Greaves who shattered the stillness again, but not in the way Cal expected. On the 16th day since the shootout, Cal and Rhett returned from the far pasture, their arms filled with saddle leather and salt blocks, to find a notice nailed to their barn door. It wasn't a handwritten threat. It was official. By order of the District Court of Prairie Bend, the property listed as Rhett is to be reclaimed by agents of Mr. Nathaniel Greaves within 5 days. Any obstruction will be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. There was a thick, red wax seal beneath the writing. Not a signature, just an impersonal stamp of power impersonating law. Cal stared at it, his fists clenching once, then consciously relaxing. Rhett didn't even bother to read it. She didn't have to. Her eyes were already on him, sharp and questioning. "What now?" she asked. "We don't wait for them," Cal said, ripping the notice from the door. "We go to them." They rode into Prairie Bend that night. It was a town stitched together from rawhide and rumors, with dry saloons, dusty storefronts, and a courthouse whose fancy pillars seemed to mock the filth surrounding them. Cal hadn't set foot in the place for a year, not since the joke of an inquest into his brother's death. Nothing had changed. The same stench of stale beer and sweat, the same folks who mastered the art of avoiding eye contact, and the same judge, Milton Avery. A man with a law book in his hand and mud on his soul. Avery didn't look surprised when Cal strode into his chambers, Rhett a silent shadow behind him. "Thought I might see you, Rorick," the judge said, leaning back in his high-backed leather chair. He had a fat, satisfied face. "Didn't expect you'd have the gall to bring the girl?" "She's not property," Cal said, his voice hard as iron. Paper says otherwise, Avery countered, tapping a neat stack of documents on his desk. Greaves's documents. A legal bill of sale. It's all in order. Cal stepped forward, placing his hands on the polished wood of the desk. Paper can lie. Avery's smile didn't falter. It was a greasy, knowing thing. Funny how ink always tells the story people pay it to tell. Greaves has money. You have a failing ranch and a heap of trouble. Rhett hadn't spoken a word since they entered. She stood behind Cal, her shoulders loose, her head held high. But her eyes, those sharp gray cut stones, never left Avery's face. She was studying him, cataloging him, and the intensity of her gaze seemed to make the judge uncomfortable for the first time. You want justice? Avery said, shifting in his chair. You need proof. Proof that Greaves's claim is false. Ownership is easy to prove. Freedom is much, much harder. Cal leaned across the desk, his voice dropping. Then I'll find proof. You give me 5 days. The full 5 days on that notice. Avery drummed his thick fingers on the desk, a smug look returning to his face. I'll give you 3. Not because I believe you have a snowball's chance in hell, but because I don't want a man like Greaves thinking I take his orders directly. He needs reminding now and then that he works for this court, not the other way around. It wasn't a favor. It was political theater, but Cal took it. As they turned to leave, Avery called after them. She's a storm, that one, Rorick. Be sure your roof can hold. Back on their horses, under a sky that was trying to swallow the moon, Rhett finally spoke. There's a woman, near Larkspur Ridge. Her name is Aline. She used to work for Greaves. Cal turned in his saddle, staring at her. The moonlight cast strange shadows on her face. Why didn't you say that before? Her answer was brutal in its honesty. Didn't think we'd make it this far. There was no bitterness in her tone, no apology, just a statement of fact from a life lived on the edge of extinction. Larkspur Ridge was 40 miles and 2 river crossings away. A hard ride. They rode straight through the next day and the night that followed, stopping only to rest the horses, never themselves. Rhett didn't seem to need sleep. Cal barely managed a few minutes, his mind racing. Who was Aline? What did she know? They found the cabin just after dawn. It stood alone, bent sideways against the wind, like it was ashamed to still be standing at all. A pale, tattered curtain twitched in the window. Then a face appeared, a woman, maybe 50, with a long, faded scar down one cheek, as if someone had tried to erase her once and failed. She opened the door before they even had a chance to knock. Rhett, she said, her voice flat and devoid of surprise. Aline, Rhett replied. Cal watched them. There were no smiles, no hugs, but something powerful passed between them. A shared history, a former closeness. Not affection, but something harder, something forged in places without light or hope. He's after you, Aline said, stepping aside to let them into the one-room cabin. I know, Rhett said. Aline's eyes, shrewd and tired, landed on Cal. This one yours? Not anybody's. Rhett answered so quickly and fiercely that Cal felt it like a punch to the gut. He pretended not to flinch. Inside, the cabin smelled of pipe smoke and wood glue. A small hand-carved doll with a face drawn on in charcoal sat on a high shelf. Aline poured 3 cups of something black and bitter that might have been coffee. Greaves will lie, she said, lighting a pipe. He'll produce a dozen witnesses who'll swear on their mother's graves that he bought you fair and square. I need someone who will say different, on the record, Cal said. Aline exhaled a plume of smoke, her eyes on Rhett. Why now? Why this one? You've run from a dozen men. Rhett's gaze flickered to Cal for a fraction of a second, then back to the older woman. Because someone finally looked at me like I wasn't already bought. The silence after that was so thick, you could have cut it with a knife. Aline didn't answer for a long time. She just puffed on her pipe, her eyes half closed. Then she nodded slowly. I'll come. I'll testify, but it won't matter, not really. Avery is in Greaves's pocket. Words won't be enough. Not unless you get the ledger. What ledger? Cal asked, leaning forward. Greaves is a prideful bastard, Aline said, a flicker of old hatred in her eyes. He likes to keep score. He has a ledger, locked in a vault in his estate. Names, dates, amounts, every girl, every sale, every transaction. He documents everything. It's his trophy case. She paused, and her next words dropped the temperature in the room by 20 degrees. But it's not just about sales, son. Greaves isn't just a trafficker. He's a supplier. He finds unique assets for his associate. The ledger doesn't just list prices, it lists properties, abilities, resistances. Cal's blood went cold. He thought of the brand on Rhett's neck. What kind of abilities? Aline looked at Rhett. The kind that get a girl called too strong or too wild. The kind that makes a man like Greaves's boss very, very interested. She turned back to Cal. That ledger is the only thing that can burn him down, but it's locked in a cast-iron vault in a house full of guards. Getting it would be suicide. That night, they slept in shifts in the tiny cabin. Rhett stayed awake the longest. At some point, Cal woke to find her standing outside, staring up at the moon. She wasn't watching for threats. She was just being motionless, as if her bones had always belonged to the open sky and had been forced into a human shape. By dawn, they were riding back toward Prairie Bend, Aline following behind them in an old, creaking buggy. They didn't speak of a plan. They didn't need to. There was only one path forward, and it led straight into the lion's den. That night, as Rhett and Aline rested at the edge of town, Cal rode alone toward the Greaves estate. Not to the front gate, not with a gun blazing, but through the dark orchards, through the back fields with gloves on his hands and silence in his boots. The place was an abomination of decadence wrapped in cruelty. Oil paintings of grim-faced ancestors, velvet chairs, and empty wine bottles everywhere. He found the office easily enough. A massive mahogany desk, 2 rifles mounted on the wall, and the vault. A cast-iron monster 6 feet tall, set into the stone of the foundation. He hadn't brought much dynamite. Just a little, just enough. The explosion was a muffled thump that shattered the night's stillness. It gave him seconds. Inside the vault was cash, papers, gold watches, and the ledger. A thick, leather-bound book with a brass clasp. He grabbed it and ran. By the time the first shouts of alarm echoed from the main house, Cal was a mile gone, and a small, determined fire had already reached the wine cellar. Back in Prairie Bend, in the pre-dawn gloom of his chambers, Judge Avery looked at the soot-stained ledger without a flicker of expression. You realize this is theft, breaking and entering. Arson. Of what? Cal asked, his voice steady. A list of his crimes, or a list of your commissions? Avery's eye twitched. He opened the book. He turned a page, then another. The judge's face, for the first time, lost its smugness. It went pale. The names, ages, prices, it was all there. But there were other columns, too. Conditioning results, physical aptitude, special markings. It wasn't just about Rhett. There were dozens of names. Some were crossed out, with a single chilling word written next to them, disposed. Avery closed the book with a sharp snap. You'll testify, Cal stated. So will Aline, Rhett said, stepping out of the shadows. The trial wasn't public, Avery insisted. Better to bury the scandal before the town gets bloody, he'd claimed. But Cal knew the truth. Avery was saving his own skin. Greaves was arrested that same day, dragged from the smoldering remains of his estate, screaming that he owned them all, that he was the law. Rhett stood at the edge of the jailhouse square and watched them load him into a prison wagon like common cattle. She didn't smile, but her shoulders dropped, just slightly, like a weight she'd stopped believing would ever leave had finally, miraculously, slipped loose. 2 weeks passed. The ranch returned to a quiet rhythm. But something fundamental had changed. Cal noticed it in the way Rhett looked at the horizon now. Not like she was waiting for an attack, but like she was finally wondering what came next for her. One evening, she sat beside him on the porch again, cleaning the grime from her hands with an oilcloth. "You still want to be alone?" she asked, her voice soft. Cal looked at her, at the fading scars on her hands, at the strength in her eyes. "No," he said, the truth of it hitting him with the force of a physical blow. "No, I don't." And this time she did smile. It was small and a little uncertain, but it was real, and it transformed her face, chasing away the last of the shadows. In that moment, Cal felt a sense of peace settle over him for the first time in years. He thought foolishly that it was over, that they had won. But the ledger Greaves kept wasn't just a record. It was an inventory. And when an asset from that inventory goes missing, the real owner eventually comes to collect. The ledger hadn't just listed names and abilities. It listed a buyer. A name Cal had skimmed over, thinking it was just another rich man. A name so powerful, so terrifying that even Greaves was just an errand boy. A name that wasn't on any map. Thaddeus Vaughn. The rains came suddenly, without warning. This wasn't the soft, life-giving kind of rain. This was a deluge, a violent downpour that made the world feel like it was unraveling at the seams. Thunder cracked so loud it shook the foundation stones of the house, and the horses, usually so calm under Rhett's watch, bucked and screamed with unease in their pens. Cal stood in the barn doorway, watching the water turn his dusty yard into a roiling sea of mud, and a feeling of deep foreboding settled in his gut. The storm wasn't just weather, it felt like an omen. That was the night the boy showed up. There was no knock on the door this time, no rider on the horizon, just a shape, slumped by the chicken coop, half drowned and so caked in mud he was almost invisible against the dark earth. Cal had stepped out to lash the last shutter closed when he spotted the heap. He was on the boy in 3 long strides, rolling him over, pressing trembling fingers to the side of his throat. Alive, barely. He couldn't have been more than 12, maybe 13. His clothes were torn to ribbons, his shoes were missing, and when Cal lifted him, he saw the raw, bloody lashes that striped the boy's back. Someone had chased him, long and far, and whipped him like an animal. Cal carried him into the house, shouting for Rhett. She didn't hesitate. She didn't ask who he was or where he'd come from. She cleared the kitchen table with one sweep of her arm, sent the medical box skidding open with the other, and dropped to her knees beside the unconscious boy. They worked in grim silence for an hour. Cal held the lamp, Rhett stitched and cleaned. The boy never woke. When they were finally done, Rhett stood up, her face a mask of cold fury. "He's been whipped," she said, her voice flinty. "Recently." "And starved," Cal agreed, looking at the boy's hollow cheeks and stick-thin limbs. "Also recently." Rhett's eyes, hard as granite, met his over the boy's still form. "This wasn't a punishment, Cal. This was a disposal. They left him for dead." They kept the boy in the spare upstairs room for 3 days. He barely stirred, lost in a fever dream filled with muttered words and panicked whimpers. On the 4th day, his eyes opened. They were wide, terrified, and they locked straight onto Rhett, who sat in a corner of the room, silently carving a small piece of wood into the shape of a bird. The boy didn't speak at first. He just watched her, his gaze unwavering. Then, he whispered a single hoarse phrase. "You're the giant." Rhett didn't look up from her carving. Her hands never stopped moving. "And you're the ghost," she replied, her voice soft. A tiny, fleeting smile touched the boy's lips. "My name's Eli." Rhett finally met his gaze. "You hungry, Eli?" He nodded once, a jerky, desperate motion. "Don't know what full feels like no more." They fed him slowly, carefully, bit by bit. He wouldn't say where he'd come from or who had hurt him, but Cal noticed things. He noticed how Eli flinched at the sound of boots on the floorboards. He noticed how he slept with his arms curled tightly around his stomach, a defensive posture so ingrained it was unconscious. Rhett didn't press him for answers, but she didn't coddle him either. You'll stay as long as you're useful, she said bluntly on his 5th day, handing him a rope halter and pointing him toward the stables. And if you break anything, you'll fix it. Eli blinked at her, then a slow, genuine grin spread across his face. You sound like someone who used to be mean. She didn't answer. But that night, Cal saw her leave a second, larger bowl of stew outside Eli's door. The storm had passed, but what it left behind wasn't peace. It was a pair of riders. They crested the ridge near sundown 2 days later, and Cal saw them through the kitchen window. They wore dark coats and carried long rifles. Their posture was too neat for ranchers. They weren't lawmen either. They stopped at the edge of the fence line, not moving forward, not waving, just sitting on their horses like crows watching a battlefield. Rhett stepped in behind Cal, took one look, and said a single word. Scouts. For who? Cal asked, though he already had a sick feeling in the pit of his stomach. Don't know, she lied, but they'll be back. They did come back, not the same men, but the same cut, silent, polished, and radiating a quiet, disciplined danger. They were men who rode with clipped beards and empty eyes. Not killers by trade, but by obedience. The kind of men who followed orders written in ledgers. Greaves might have been locked away, but he had only been a branch. The root was still deep in the ground, and it was angry. What are they looking for? Cal asked after the 3rd sighting in as many days. Rhett was watching Eli through the window. The boy had gone still as soon as the riders were mentioned. He was trying to hide it, but Cal could see the tremble in his hands as he gathered eggs from the hen house. Not me, Rhett said quietly. Him. That night, Cal sat with the boy at the kitchen table. The house was quiet, the only sound the ticking of the old clock on the mantel. Who's after you, Eli? Cal asked gently. Eli stared at the scarred wood of the table, his small shoulders hunched. Someone worse than Greaves, he whispered, his voice barely audible. Someone who owns towns, not people. Greaves was a thief. This man, he makes monsters. He didn't say the name. He didn't have to. It was Rhett, standing in the doorway, who whispered it like a curse, confirming Cal's deepest fear. Thaddeus Vaughn. Cal had only heard the name once before, at a trading post a year back. A drunk prospector had spoken it while looking over his shoulder the whole time, as if saying the name itself was a death sentence. Vaughn was a cattle magnate, turned land baron, turned something else entirely. No one knew where he lived. No one even knew what he looked like anymore. There were just stories, whispers of entire families who lived on land he wanted simply disappearing overnight. How'd you get away from a man like that? Cal asked Eli, his voice gentle. Eli finally looked up, and his eyes were hollow, ancient things in a child's face. I didn't, he said. Someone let me go. A woman. A medic. She said I wasn't like the others. She said I should run before I turned into what they were making us into. A cold dread washed over Cal. What were they making you into, son? Eli's gaze was direct, his voice suddenly clear and steady. Weapons. That night, Cal didn't sleep. He walked the fence line, his shotgun heavy in his hand, his mind a whirlwind of horror. This was no longer about Rhett, or her freedom, or even the justice they had won against Greaves. Now there was a child, a boy hunted by something deeper and more monstrous than simple greed. And still, Rhett stayed. He found her outside near dawn, braiding the colt's mane, whispering something low and soothing to the animal. You could leave, you know, Cal said, his voice rough. You're not a prisoner here. You're free. Rhett didn't answer for a long moment. He tried again. Why did you stay? After the trial, after Greaves was gone. Why stay here? She ran a hand down the colt's strong neck, her scarred fingers gentle. Because I know what it feels like to be seen as a thing, she said, her voice quiet but firm. And I know what it feels like when someone finally sees more. She paused. And because your brother asked me to. Cal froze. What? She finally looked up, her gray eyes piercing him. Thomas. I met him once, a long time ago. He knew who I was, what I was running from. He told me if I ever got clear, I should come here. He said this place was safe. He said he was building a wall against the storm. She looked around at the small, dusty ranch. I guess this was it. The scouts returned 3 days later. But this time, they didn't just watch. This time, they crossed the fence. There were 2 of them, and they moved with a cold, arrogant confidence. Cal met them at the edge of the pasture, his rifle held loosely at his side. He'd hidden Eli in the cellar, the one place he knew the boy would be safe. Rhett was supposed to be up on the ridgeline, checking the water traps, out of sight. The first man dismounted. "You've got something that doesn't belong to you," he said. It wasn't a question. Cal didn't blink. "Say that again. Slower. The boy, Eli, he's property of Mr. Vaughn. By the authority of the Volitional Reassignment Project, you will surrender him to us, now." Volitional reassignment. Cal's mind reeled. It wasn't just a man. It was a project, an organization. That was the moment Cal saw it. Around the man's neck on a thin chain was a small pendant shaped like a bull's horn, cast in a strange, dark metal. A mark of Vaughn's inner circle. Cal spat in the dirt. "You got 2 minutes to turn around and ride out of here," he said, his voice deadly quiet. The man simply smiled. "I don't think so." So Cal whistled. A high, sharp, piercing sound. Not for Rhett, for the colt. The horse came first, riderless, galloping from the ridge like a bolt of lightning, a beautiful, terrifying distraction. Then came Rhett. She moved like a shadow flowing down the hillside, a rifle already at her shoulder. By the time she reached the fence line, the 2 scouts were already backing away, their confidence shattered. "We'll be back," one of them hissed, his face pale. Rhett leveled her rifle at him. "I hope so," she said, and her voice was a promise of violence. That night, Cal drew a map on the kitchen table. 3 options. Stay and fight a war they couldn't win. Flee and spend the rest of their lives looking over their shoulders. Or strike first. Rhett chose the last option without a moment's hesitation. "You can't outrun a man who buys counties," she said, her finger jabbing the map. "But you can burn down the thing he needs to stay a king." So they made a plan, a desperate, insane plan. They needed information. They needed allies. And most of all, they needed proof. Proof that Vaughn's operation wasn't just a rumor. Proof that the weapons he was building weren't just a frightened boy's story. And for that, they had to go back to the one place Eli had sworn he would never return. The place he had escaped from. The heart of the monster. Eli didn't want to go. He begged them, tears streaming down his face. But Rhett knelt before him, placing her large, scarred hands on his small shoulders. She looked him right in the eye. "Sometimes," she said, her voice softer than Cal had ever heard it, "you have to walk back through the fire to make sure no one else ever gets burned." The boy cried. Not loud, not messy, just 2 silent tears that traced paths through the dust on his cheeks. Then he wiped them away and nodded. By the end of the week, they were packed. Cal left the ranch in the care of an old friend, a half-blind prospector named Brewster, who owed him 3 favors and still shot straighter than most men with 2 good eyes. They rode out at night, 3 small figures against a vast, uncaring landscape. A grieving rancher who'd stumbled into a war. A girl the world had tried to tame and failed. And a boy made of shadows and scars, now leading them back into the darkness. They were heading towards something vast and terrible. But for the first time, they weren't running from it. They were riding to meet it, and none of them turned back. Not once. They followed the canyon trail through the scrublands of Calera Bluff, a brutal, unforgiving stretch of land. They crossed bone-dry flatlands under a sky that was smeared copper and ash, like a fresh bruise. The land had teeth out here. The cacti grew like angry spears, the cliffs were jagged like broken glass, and the wind howled from nowhere and never seemed to stop moving. Cal had ridden this path before, years back, during a cattle trade gone wrong, but now it felt different. It felt hungry, like something was hunting them in the silence. Eli barely spoke. He rode hunched in his saddle, his small hands clutching the reins so tight his knuckles were white. He was a boy drowning in memory. Rhett rode just behind him, a steady, silent presence. She didn't offer empty words of comfort. She just stayed. She stood her ground. And somehow, that was more than enough. It took them 3 grueling days to reach the outpost. Once it might have been a thriving mining camp. Now it was just bones and rust. The only things left were a half-buried rail line disappearing into the earth and a single shack, slouched sideways as if it had simply given up. This was the marker Eli remembered. A place called Marrow Gap. No one lived here anymore except the wind and the birds that had forgotten how to sing. "This is where they watched us," Eli said, his voice a dry whisper as he dismounted. "They'd bring us here from the compound. They'd make us run through the canyon, from sunrise to sunset. If you stopped, they'd fire into the air above your head. The next time you stopped, they'd aim lower." Cal scanned the desolate horizon. "You said the compound was west of here." 3 miles, Eli confirmed, pointing a trembling finger toward a line of jagged black rock that looked like a dragon's spine. "Maybe 4, past the black rock. You can't miss it." They made camp inside the dilapidated shack. Rhett took the first watch. She didn't sit still for a second. She kept her rifle slung over her shoulder and paced from shadow to shadow, her eyes constantly scanning the canyon, as if she expected the rocks themselves to stand up and attack. When Cal took over near dawn, she finally rested, but it wasn't sleep. She crouched near the doorway, a knife held loosely in her hand, her back pressed against the wall, as if she wanted to become part of it. "Why'd you let them buy you?" Cal asked into the pre-dawn quiet. The question was low, not cruel, just real. It had been eating at him for weeks. She didn't flinch. Her eyes remained fixed on the darkness. "Because they said I was too wild to be owned," she answered, her voice flat. "And I wanted to prove them wrong. I wanted to see what kind of man would be foolish enough to try." "And was I?" he asked, his heart hammering against his ribs. She finally turned to look at him, her eyes steady in the gloom. "Now I ride beside you, don't I?" He almost smiled. He almost reached for her. But something behind her, far in the distance, caught his eye and made him stiffen. Movement. It wasn't a bird. It wasn't the wind playing tricks with the shadows. It was a shape, on the ridge, moving too fast to be natural, too slow to be a spooked animal. It was methodical. It was a patrol. "Rhett," he breathed. She was already up, rifle in hand. Eli stirred from his bedroll, his eyes wide with a familiar terror. "They're here," the boy whispered. "They knew we were coming." They moved at dusk. They left the horses tethered deep inside an old, collapsed mine shaft and traveled the rest of the way on foot, skirting along ridgelines and ducking under scrub brush. Eli led the way. He didn't speak, just pointed. Once to a ridge shaped like a wolf's back. Once to a flat stone marked with a single rusted horseshoe nailed into its face. These were the markers of his nightmare. At last, they reached it. The compound, or what was left of it. It was a low, sprawling structure, half swallowed by the earth, like a great concrete beast burrowing into the ground. From a distance, it looked like a military bunker. Up close, it looked like a wound. The steel doors were warped by intense heat. Barbed wire lay in collapsed, rusted knots along the fence line. But the buildings themselves were mostly intact. Too intact. There were no signs of wild animals, no tracks from looters. Just a dead, expectant silence. "They didn't abandon this place," Rhett whispered, her hand resting on the hilt of her knife. "They relocated." "And left it as bait," Cal muttered, his eyes scanning the empty watchtowers. They went in anyway. There was no other choice. The first room was tiled in white, though most of the tiles were cracked and stained. On the far wall, a phrase was etched deep into the concrete, the letters stark and brutal. "Break the soul before you bend the bone." Eli's hands began to tremble violently. "That That was above every hallway, he whispered, his voice cracking. They said it was to remind us why we were here. They passed through a long, dark dormitory, rows of rusted metal bed frames, each fitted with thick leather straps at the wrists and ankles. The air still stank of old bleach, metal, and something else. Something coppery and sad. Rhett stopped in the center of the room, her face pale. Her voice was hollow. They broke children in here. They didn't just break us, Eli said, his voice gaining a strange, hard edge. They tested us. They found it in the third wing of the compound, a library, but it wasn't a library of books. It was a library of lives, an archive of cruelty. Metal filing cabinets lined the walls, the drawers labeled with numbers, not names. Cal pulled one open. Inside were files, blueprints, and photographs. So many photographs, photos of boys and girls, some younger than Eli, standing in front of grids, their eyes blank and empty. Some had fresh bruises on their faces. Others were fitted with strange, terrifying harnesses made of leather and steel, contraptions that wrapped around their arms, their backs, even their spines. Cal picked up a file at random. The photo showed a young boy, maybe 10 years old, with defiant eyes. Subject 34B, name, NA. Response to chemical acceleration, fail. Note, spine collapsed on contact, deceased. Rhett picked up another. The photo was of a girl with fiery red hair, a smear of dirt on her cheek. Subject 22G, name, NA. Resistance to pain conditioning, high. Emotional suppression, fail. Note, prone to violent outbursts, marked for disposal. Then Cal saw it. A file slightly thicker than the others. He pulled it out. Subject 17D. The photo was of a younger, thinner Eli, but the same fierce eyes stared back at him. Name, Elijah, Eli. Age, 12. Resistance to bone density alteration, high. Agility trials, passed. Obedience trials, failed. Note, subject exhibits dangerous levels of independent thought, marked for immediate disposal. Eli turned away, unable to look. You were strong, Cal said softly. Too strong for them. They said I'd be the first one to kill without permission, Eli whispered, his back still to them. That's why they stopped the tests on me. They weren't afraid I'd fail. They were afraid of what I'd choose to do on my own if I succeeded. And what would you have chosen? Rhett asked, her voice gentle. Eli finally turned to face them, and his eyes were clear. Run, he said, and take everyone else with me. They gathered everything they could carry. They bundled the blueprints, the photos, the horrific proof of Vaughn's atrocities into their saddlebags. They were halfway back to the mine where they'd left the horses when the shots rang out. 1, 2, then a brief silence before a volley of gunfire erupted from the ridge above them. Eli fell forward with a scream, not from a wound, but from the raw, soul-deep memory the sound triggered. Cal grabbed him, dragging him behind a large boulder. Rhett didn't hesitate. She dropped to her stomach, her rifle already at her shoulder, and scoped the horizon. 5 riders, she yelled over the ricocheting bullets. Fast and coordinated. They're Vaughn's professionals. They weren't the hired thugs Greaves had used. These were soldiers. No colors, no flags, just deadly efficiency. She fired once, a perfect shot that hit a horse in the flank. The rider tumbled, hit the rocks hard, and didn't move. Cal grabbed his own rifle, took aim, and dropped a second man from his saddle. But 3 remained, and they weren't firing wildly anymore. They were circling, herding them, cutting off their escape. We're not making it back to the mine together, Rhett shouted, her voice like iron. We have to split up. No! Cal snapped back, reloading. We stick together. Split up, she repeated, her voice a command that could not be disobeyed. They'll follow me. I'm the bigger threat. You take Eli, you take the evidence, and you get to the ridge. Go! She didn't wait for his permission. She burst from behind their cover, running straight into the open, her rifle blazing. She was a magnificent, terrifying sight. 2 of the remaining riders immediately veered, their attention locked on her as she disappeared into a curve of the canyon. The 3rd turned to pursue Cal and Eli, but Cal was ready. He tackled the man from behind, his rifle cracking across the soldier's spine. The two of them tumbled into the dust. Cal rolled on top, grabbed the man's own knife from his belt, and drove it into his shoulder. "Who sent you?" Cal barked, his face inches from the man's. The man just smiled, blood bubbling between his teeth. He looked past Cal, in the direction Rhett had run. "She's not wild," he coughed, his voice a rattling whisper. "She's the storm." Then his eyes went vacant and he died. Cal didn't stop. He grabbed Eli and ran. They scrambled across the gulch, down through the narrow, twisting passages of the canyon, and up onto the high ridge. The wind tore at them. The sky roared overhead. But they didn't look back. They found the horses where they'd left them, shaking and scared, but alive. Cal threw Eli onto the colt, mounted his own horse, and they rode. They rode until the sun bled dry. They rode until the canyon vanished behind them. They rode until they collapsed from exhaustion near the burned-out shell of a chapel 3 counties to the west. Rhett wasn't there. Not yet. But Cal refused to believe she was gone. He couldn't. 2 days passed. They hid in the chapel ruins, surviving on hardtack and muddy river water. Eli slept in fits and starts. Cal didn't sleep at all. On the 3rd morning, the horses stirred, their ears pricked forward. Then came the sound of boots on stone. Cal stood, his rifle drawn and ready. But when the figure emerged from the broken archway of the chapel, he lowered the gun. It was Rhett. Her coat was torn, her hair was caked with dried blood and dirt, but she was walking. She was alive. She limped up to them and tossed a heavy cloth satchel onto the ground. "More evidence," she said, her voice raspy. Cal opened it. Inside was a strange, bronze-colored helmet, intricately wired with copper filaments. There was dried blood on the inside. "They called it the catalyst," Rhett said, slumping down against the ruined wall. "It was supposed to rewire instincts, make the boys go feral on command. But it never worked on Eli. He tore it off his own head mid-trial. That's when they marked him for disposal. He didn't just resist them. He broke their machine." Cal looked at Eli. The boy was staring at the helmet as if it were a monster's severed head. He looked from the helmet to Rhett, then to the files Cal had saved. "Do we have enough?" Cal asked, his voice full of a desperate hope. Rhett met his gaze. A slow, grim smile spread across her face. It was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. "Oh yeah," she said. "We have enough to burn them. All of them."